the senator giving us his campaign update. And now our featured speaker, Matt Mayer, has been here before. He was president of the Buckeye Institute. He's now, I think, a visiting fellow.
I am, and I've been for about 5 years at Heritage, yeah.
Right, with Heritage. And he has a new book out that sounds very intriguing. I'll let him come up and speak to us about it and get an update from him. Matt, glad you could come back.
All right, thanks for having me. Everybody can hear me okay? All right, let's get that. Okay, you ready to go for a fun ride? Because we're going to go for a fun ride. Some of you might not like what I have to say, but you didn't last time I was here, so it's okay. Works out okay if we do it that way, especially some of the politicians sometimes. So Matt Mayer ran the Buckeye Institute for about 2.5 years till the end of last year, left, wrote a book that you all get a free copy of afterwards. It's called Taxpayers Don't Stand a Chance, Why Battleground Ohio Loses No Matter Who Wins and What to Do About it. And then it launched a new think tank in the last few weeks called Opportunity Ohio. You can go to opportunityohio.org to the website. That has lots of data that's inside the book listed on there. A couple things about the book. One, I'm not going to make a dime off this book. I've decided, my wife and I don't do these things alone. I wish I could sometimes, but I don't. We're going to donate 100% of all net proceeds from the sales of the book to two entities. One is the Reagan Library to help further the legacy of Ronald Reagan, because I think we all think that's a good thing. And the other is to the C3 state-based think tanks across America, the kind of engines of innovation, laboratories of competition, the ones that we want to set the agendas in all 50 states so that we can fix America from the ground up, not from DC down, because that actually we all know will never, ever happen. So the money's all going there. You're going to get a free copy today that I'll sign. What I would ask you is to pay it forward. If you don't like the book, use it for target practice. If you do like the book, I'd love for you to go on to Amazon and buy a copy. That helps with my ranking on Amazon. But the money all goes to those two entities. But it gets the word out. Give the copy to a friend. So if you like it, pay it forward and help us out. You're getting a free copy because the National Foundation has underwritten a book tour of Ohio for me. So I'm going to be traveling. I was down in Cincinnati yesterday. I'll be traveling all over Ohio handing out copies of the book. So so that's a good thing, but it doesn't help my ranking on Amazon, which is always really important to get noticed. So let's talk about the book. So the book really is focused on Ohio as a case study. Ohio, as we all know, is a battleground state. And so the book starts out with what's called, Ohio's fall from power. And, 100 years ago, Ohio was a national leader. We were the land of presidents. 8 had come from Ohio from our founding as a state until 1923. And we have not had a president since 1923 come from Ohio. In fact, of the last 9 presidents, 7 have come from the south and west of the United States. And you're going to see that when you read the book, you'll see that theme consistently throughout the book, that the south and west are where we are seeing most of kind of the leadership, the innovation rise from America. We used to be the land of titans in innovation: Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, National Cash Register, Procter & Gamble, still around, but these companies are well over 100 years old. They were really leading the American economy back 100 years ago. Today, the companies leading the charge are all from the south and west of America. Apple, Dell, Amazon, Walmart. I mean, you can go through various companies that you know by name and the leaders that you know, Starbucks, Facebook. They're all from the south and west of America. And then we used to be an economic power. 100 years ago, the net average income in Ohio was 9.7% above the national average. So we were a very wealthy, prosperous state. Today, we are now 9.4% below the national average. So we're now a poorer state. And so you think about those things, and so what happened to Ohio? How did we go from a national leader to a national laggard? Well, let me give you a few reasons why. One, the political system in Ohio does not work. The current system and the leadership we get out of the current system on the right and the left is not working. And you can say, well, wow, Matt, how can you say it's not working? Well, I can tell you it's not working because we have among the highest state local tax burden in the country. We have government spending that has exploded over the last few decades, and we have a jobs economy that's among the worst in the country. I would say to you, if we had the right leadership, we wouldn't have those problems. And so that becomes a real thorn as you move forward. We think about the state general revenue fund of the state budget. In the last 22 years, and this includes the budget that just got passed last year, this is the governor's budget, increases spending by 148%. When you adjust for inflation, it's more than 44% above inflation over that 22-year period of time, which averages 2% more every single year. So state government just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, no matter who's in charge. And again, most of that was actually under Republican leadership in the legislature and Republican governors. So this is not a partisan issue. This is actually a bipartisan problem. I think Jim talked about why you guys came about 4 years ago. Well, this is part of the problem that I think you've already identified. From a job standpoint, from 1990 to 2000, our private sector economy added jobs at a pace that was the 38th best in America. So we added jobs, but we added jobs at a very slow pace compared to the other 49 states. The last decade, 2000 to 2010, we lost more jobs in every single state except Michigan. So we were the 50th worst jobs economy in the country. If you look at the peak employment, our peak employment in Ohio private sector was March of 2000. 4.85 million Ohioans worked in our private sector. If you adjust for population growth since then, so we've added some people in the last 12 years, and you project based upon growth projections, we will not get back to that peak number until November of 2021. So a kid born in March of 2000 when we hit that peak will be essentially in their third year of college by the time Ohio gets back to that number. And that just puts it in perspective for you. And I know the governor has been talking about, since he's been governor, we've had one of the strongest jobs economy. It's a little bit misleading. The reason why is because he's using raw numbers. Well, we're the 7th largest state. So we're going to add more jobs than Delaware, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, just because we have a whole lot more people than most of the other states. So in sheer numbers, the numbers are going to look good. When you adjust for population, look at percent growth over the last 15 months, we're actually the 24th best in the country. So we fall quite a bit when you actually do what I would consider the apples to apples comparison and adjust, so you normalize for that population differences among the states. Because otherwise, California is the best state ever, and we all know California is not, just because there's so many people there, right? So the political system's not working. The other problem is, there's a tendency to focus on the wrong problems. Once we get folks in Columbus, they tend to focus on the wrong problems. Let me give you 3 examples of that over the last 30 years. Example number 1 is Governor Dick Celeste. Walks in, gets his Democrat majority, jams through collective bargaining. And we all know from last year's SB 5 issue 2 debate, that collective bargaining essentially was done on a purely partisan line, and since then you've seen local, state costs accelerate, and at the local level, as we know, 80 to 100% of costs are swallowed by compensation packages. So that act essentially foisted us with what we could have expected was massive tax increases over the course of the next 30 years, and that's in fact what has happened, which is why we have one of the highest local tax burdens in the entire country in Ohio. The second one is under Governor Strickland, where essentially you put all of our eggs in the green energy basket, right? Everything became about windmills and biomass and everything under the sun. Again, this is where when government picks winners and losers, the problem is they're not very good. And they don't understand the market. So China does what it does, which is it pushes out lots of stuff. And what do you know? The green market collapses because there's an oversupply. Spain, Germany all pull out, and we have now massive bankruptcies like Solyndra and other companies because we essentially put all our eggs in that basket, and that was going to be the next hope of manufacturing, rather than looking at the diversified economy, rather than trying to fix the economy on a broad scale base, create an environment for prosperity and growth, not try to pick winners and losers. The last example you might not like to hear about is Governor Kasich's severance tax proposal, where he wants to jack tight taxes on Ohio's small and energy companies. And I know he talks about Chesapeake and Exxon, but the reality is there are 2,500 small Ohio-based companies that employ 10 to 15 people that have been in the business for a long time, and this Utica Shale is a real opportunity for them, and he wants to essentially increase taxes on those folks by 16-fold when you do the math on it. And so what is it, all so that when he's up for re-election, we can all get a little bit of a tax return in terms of an income tax cut, which we all support income tax. What I said about it is, great, love the income tax piece of it. How about you just cut government spending and fund it? Why are we going to raise taxes on spending? And by the way, keep in mind, these folks are already paying the CAT tax, and most of them pay personal income tax. So, essentially what he is saying is we're going to take this one little sector, we're going to put an additional tax on them so that the rest of Ohio can essentially get a little bit of a tax cut. And the other problem is his projections are way off. They projected that each well would cost about $5 million to do, and it would produce about $75 million in output. And so that ended up for each of us getting about a $46 income tax rebate. The problem is that field tests are coming back showing that it's about $10 million cost, and the actual output is closer to about $20 million, which means at the end of the day we're going to fight a huge fight, and he just did a press conference yesterday in Columbus. We're going to spend all this energy so that you guys can get about a $5 tax cut in 2014. Makes no sense. Again, focused on the wrong problems, and that's part of our issue. Next, you'll love this one, I hope. There is this thing I call GINOs. You heard this before? I had to trademark this. GINOs. Journalist in name only. Journalists in name only. So let's talk about this. There's tons of attention that's been paid at the national level on the national media bias, right? We all know that, right? Meet the Press, all those types of organizations. But very little time has been spent on what happens at the state and local level in terms of media. And so, when I was at Buckeye for 2.5 years, we did a whole lot of stuff, and I know some of you probably followed some of that work we did, whether it was the report that led to collective bargaining reform, whether it was the Smart on Crime that led to criminal justice reform, whether it was the Medicaid stuff we did a lot of really game-changing stuff. Well, that game-changing stuff never ever made it into the newspapers on the news side of the house. The fact of the matter is we did 10 reports in a game-changing poll, and of the 6 major newspapers, they essentially covered us 0 times. So we went 0 for 66, which I'm not a math genius, but it seems to be statistically not possible to essentially never get a single news story. So, but at the same time that the news side of these newspapers essentially isn't reporting a single thing coming out of the conservative think tank in Ohio, right? The editorial side of those newspapers is citing the Buckeye Institute more than 20 times on various issues. Oh, this raises troubling questions we should look at. Troubling questions the news side can't figure out how to even talk about, right? And so as that's happening, there's a disconnect within the newspapers between the editorial side and the news side, and we know the little bias in the news side of the house. And at the same time, all the left-wing think tanks, they issue as much as a press release that gets reported in the newspapers. And so, again, why does that matter? Well, it matters because as taxpayers, how are you supposed to get informed if you have no idea that there's all this information out there that helps you make the best decision? And you guys are activists. What do you think about average Joe and Jane Ohio who doesn't take the time to come to meetings like this, who doesn't do the research on the websites? They have no idea. All they do is they read a paper, and if that's not in the paper, it doesn't exist. And so that it really impacted, I would argue with you, the whole issue to SB 5. That there was just, most Ohioans had no idea about the information and have bought into the 30-year narrative that government workers are underpaid. And that created a problem. So the GINOs are responsible. But it's not just at the state level. At the local level, this happens pervasively. And I'm talking about your weekly little newspaper you get for free. Those things, by and large, are organs of city, county, and school districts across the state. They simply churn out whatever it is those government entities want them to churn out. No critical coverage. You read the article, you can tell there's no hard questions ever asked of the administrators, superintendents, anything. There's never a opposing side cited in these stories. So even when they do cover the stuff, what they're covering is there's never the other side of the story. So they never say, oh, you want to raise the tax levy on the school district, and they never report on, interesting, you have 6% fewer pupils, yet your per pupil spending has gone up X, teacher pay has gone up 15% while inflation was 9. None of that stuff gets presented, so taxpayers are kind of, again, left at a disadvantage from an informational standpoint at this. And then finally, it's also these little issues. You hear the media always lament, oh, we really need to come together. Why can't they come together? Why can't we just get everybody, working together on these things? And so you know what I did? There was a left-wing think tank up in Cleveland, and it was led by a guy named John McGallow, who was a Democrat legislator back in the 70s and early 80s. Terrific guy. He issued a report, had left-wing stuff in it, but it also had some interesting ideas for reform. So I reached out to John, and I said, I think you and I might go to work together. You never know what a Venn diagram is?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's those 2 circles, right, and when they overlap, it's the overlapping part where you have commonality. John and I could figure out where we have commonality. And so, what we said, can we work on where we have commonality? And so together we came up with $300 million in tax expenditure cuts. That then we had disagreed on what to do with them. He wanted them funded back in the government. I wanted those to fund essentially small business tax cuts and things that would help grow the economy. But we came together $300 million. Just yesterday, it was reported that that effort died because our state and Senate leadership and House leadership couldn't find a single tax expenditure to eliminate.
Oh.
Not a one. Not a one.
Oh my God.
Not a one. And that is just shameful. But so we went even further. I said, John, we're doing some good stuff. Let's do a conference. So we go do a day-long conference down in Columbus on the big issues facing Ohio. Pensions, the Constitution, you name it. Okay? And more importantly, the lunchtime speakers. Anybody here? Art Laffer?
Yeah.
Laffer curve? Right? One of the world's most influential economists on the right you can possibly imagine. Anybody here of Alice Rivlin? Well, if I were in a Democrat progressive room, you'd say yes. Alice Rivlin was the first director of the Congressional Budget Office. She was Bill Clinton's budget director when he balanced the budget. And she was on the National Debt Commission. She is one of the kind of top economists on the right or left, not the Krugmans who are just discreditable, but she is just a good sound voice on the left for economic policy. We brought those two into town for a lunchtime discussion on where we're headed as a country, right? These people have advised presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, czars, all those kind of folks, right? Do you know how many of your elected officials managed to walk across the street from the State House to the hotel to forget about the whole day conference of issues that they're going to be supposed to be dealing with? Just that little lunchtime debate hosted by Colleen Marshall of NBC4. How many, guess how many walked across the street?
15.
5. 5 out of 133. Okay? 32.
5 out of 32.
Of 100.
100.
Yeah, so right, we have 33 senators and 99 House members, so 132. Now, how many reporters, how many of the newspapers covered that debate? None. Not a single newspaper. Do you think if that happened in Washington, New York, LA, Chicago, do you think maybe somebody would do a report on these two world-class economists coming together and having this wonderful debate over the future of our country's fiscal policy? I would think so. At any rate, but they chose not to cover that, right? So it's that kind of stuff where there's this lack of engagement. Then we get to the next problem we face here in Ohio is the power of entrenched interest. And I think you know what I mean here. By and large, that is called labor unions. I know some people might like that message, but that is the reality. SB5 showed that, $42 million in funding that absolutely crushed the other side. And you ask yourself, how did this happen in Ohio when Wisconsin just got such different results there? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But here's what's so interesting. It shows you how unions own this state. Collective bargaining passed in 1983. Do you know how many amendments have happened to that legislation since it was first enacted? 0. Not a one. Voinovich was going to in 95 and then decided he wanted to run for the U.S. Senate and didn't want the labor unions coming out too aggressively, so he gave up. Obviously SB5 was passed, but that didn't get sustained. Other than that, not a single time have they amended. There is not another statute on the books on such an issue where it hasn't been tweaked even over the last 3 decades. That one hasn't been tweaked because if it's even talked about, right, the unions go to the Democrat legislature and say, don't you dare touch that. And we saw that when not a single Democrat offered an amendment in the House or the Senate. No one broke with their party. We had folks break with ours, the Republicans. And so that shows you this. In fact, Gerald McEntee, he is the head of the ASME, which is one of the big unions. After Wisconsin, they asked him, well, what do you think? And he issued a press release. And you know what his press release said? He blamed all these, they brought in all this big company money and, there's fraud and all this stuff. And then, I kid you not, you can go to the website, find his statement, in bold in the statement, and I'm going to paraphrase just for fun, but in bold, you can read it yourself to get the real words, but essentially in bold, then puts, but let's not forget, we own Ohio, baby. I kid you not. He says, but look what we did in Ohio when we crushed Governor Kasich and da-da-da-da-da. Right? So they're looking, everybody looks at Ohio and says, well, we own that state still. And I can tell you that's a problem. And why is it a problem? Because we've got to get this state moving, and that drives government costs up, and the private sector hurts jobs, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk a minute about SB 5 and the lessons we can learn from SB 5. One, there's way too little education done on the issue. Really, I mean, you cannot expect to combat a 30-year narrative of the underpaid government worker in the course of essentially 5 months with little money and little message. So one, little education done, and that's a lesson to be learned. If you want anything big change to happen in Ohio, we're going to have to do a very aggressive education campaign to lay the groundwork. It happened in Wisconsin, didn't happen here. There was absolutely no end-to-end strategy to get this done. You know, Shannon Jones dropped that legislation. There was no strategy to get it through a veto referendum. So they thought, well, we own the House, we own the Senate, we own the governor's office, we'll get this done, and that'll be it, which is naive, right? If you're going to go to if you're going to be an existential threat to the public sector unions, which SB 5 was, you could have expected and should have expected that they would have put a veto referendum on the ballot. It was only 2008 when payday lending got put on by a veto referendum, so it's not like this was a surprise. Oh, wait, there's this thing called a veto referendum? So we should have expected that and planned for that. No planning was done whatsoever. The assumption was you pass the legislation, the governor signs it, it's game over, we won. Well, that was only halftime, folks, and you can see what happened in the second half. No end-to-end strategy. 3, complexity kills. You can't have a 300-page bill and expect voters to understand it. You may, but again, average Joe and Jane Ohio, who just looks at a headline, looks at a quick thing, complexity kills. So when they go to a ballot, voters will say, oh, if it's really complex, they just find one thing they don't like, they vote against it. And that's essentially what happened. That's essentially what happened. They were unified and we were not. We were not unified at all. We obviously had folks split from our side of the fence. There were times where the governor was essentially distancing himself from the legislation, did it on TV once, didn't talk about it at all other than one sentence in his State of the State address a week after the Senate barely got it out. Houston obviously voted with the unions on the ballot language, yes or no vote. That was the problem. The money was raised, their side, they raised money for one thing and one thing only, killing SB 5. We had money being raised to defend the governor's budget. We had it for Jobs in Ohio. We had all these other groups coming in for Obamacare. So lots of things being raised, which diluted our ability to raise adequate amount of money. And then there was lots of just redundancy on our side of the fence, repeatedly doing things that didn't seem to make sense in terms of wasting information. Our message was late and ineffective. The first direct mail piece did not hit homes till after Labor Day. I can tell you the game was over by Labor Day. They had spent the whole summer doing all that they could do on the left to kill it. By the time Labor Day hit, we stood no chance at that point. Our message was late and it was ineffective. We got into the provisional defense of the bill. Oh, this provision's great, that provision's great, that provision's great. Again, the problem with that is they just need to point to one provision that wasn't great, game over. Our argument from day one should have been about one thing. Do you want higher taxes or do you want the public sector to live like the private sector? It's a very simple contrast. And I would say to you, the reason we should have done that was borne out on Election Day. 62% voted to defeat the Senate Bill 5 reforms. At the same time, 78% of levies went down. So people appeared not to like taxes a whole lot more, right? More they wanted to protect government worker pay and compensation. And so we had lost opportunity on messaging. There were lots of missteps along the way. You know the stuff about being, the governor calling the cop an idiot on tape, taking the Grandma Zoe message and misappropriating that. Lots of things like that. And so we're now stuck in a situation where we have very little trying to control the costs that we're dealing with here at the local level, and you're seeing that as in the last year, the net taxes on Ohioans have gone up in Ohio because of local levies. In March, after that emotional blackmail after November, essentially they passed 58% of all levies, which was the highest passage rate in over a decade. So that gets us to local property, the local property and tax assault issue. I mean, this is what happens in Ohio, is you get hit again and again with these levies. If it fails the first time, they'll put it up a second time. And when they put it up a second time, right, they spent the last intervening time hitting you with the emotional blackmail. If you care about AP courses for your kid, they say we're going to cut the AP courses. If you care about football, they say, well, we're going to cut sports, we're going to make you pay to play. If you care about band, they say, oh, we're going to have to get rid of the band or do some other things. Or no matter what it is, right? They hit you on all the issues. Or class size, that's the nuclear bomb. Oh, we're going to have huge class sizes, and everybody thinks that's somehow a problem. Though most of us we're in a system where there are at least 35 kids in the classroom and somehow we manage. But nonetheless, that they hit you with that. The other problem is, you guys, you know, it's very hard to get somebody to open up their wall to fund an opposition campaign, right? I have to say, okay, it's going to cost me to hit, in most districts, it'll cost me at least $2,000 to do one mailing so I can try to win, okay? So I'm going to write a check for $2,000. Well, if the tax is going to be $150 per 100,000, you start doing the math going, at some point it doesn't make sense for me to spend money, I'd rather just pay the tax and it's cheaper, right? We're all fiscal conservatives, I think, and we do the math. But, you know, even if you want to do it that first time, then they put it on the second time, and now you get even more money. And guess what you're up against? Who funds the levy campaigns? We do partially through all the stuff that they don't, as long as they don't vote for it. But everyone thinks it's the unions. It's not the unions. You know who it is? Vendors. School district and city and county vendors. Go to your Board of Elections and get the contribution reports on your levies. And you will find, as I did, and it's happening all over the state, 72% of the funds that funded the levy campaigns in my school district came from vendors who had received over $12 million from the school district. The lunch people, the textbook, the technology. So you can't possibly fight those folks, because they'll write a $5,000 check as often as they have to make sure they get their money and keep their contracts flush. So we're up against a system that just is horribly, horribly unfair. And one of the things we talk about is, why don't we see more school districts or others saying, you know what, we've got to do base compensation package reductions. We just can't afford the system that we built up. We're sorry. Private sector's had cuts and layoffs. We just have to do it. And people can't, again, it's a math issue. So the OEA, their dues are based on a percentage of the statewide teacher salary. So I'm going to walk through this. It's in the book, so you'll be able to look at the numbers specifically, but stay with me on this, okay? The average right now is about $63,000 per teacher. Now, if you amortize it to that for the 1,350-hour work year they work, you can do the math. That's probably close to about $100,000 actual salary in terms of a prorated full work year that we work in the private sector. But $63,000. If you reduce that by $1,000, that's it. So the average goes from 63 to 62. The OEA would lose about $780,000 in dues money. Now, you do $780,000 divided by 479, which is the average due each teacher pays. You'd have to lay off 1,600 teachers statewide in order for the math to make sense to do comp cuts versus layoffs. So what do you see? Layoffs. In any given year, only about 600 teachers ever get laid off. So the idea, right, that you say, oh, well, hey, look, let's just kick that young 1 or 2 or 3 teachers out. We'll maintain the high pay, because the math is for them. If they keep the high pay across the state, they get that money coming in. If the dues number comes down, they'd rather kick out a handful of teachers, because it doesn't hit until 1,601 teacher gets laid off in the state before the math works against them. So that's why you see some of these problems occur. Finally, we've got forced unionization. Huge issue here in Ohio. We are one of the most heavily unionized states in the country. And there's some problems with that, right? Unions served a very good purpose 100 years ago. There is no doubt about that, right? We would not have the work environments we have today but for labor, and in many cases, literally the blood, sweat, and tears of labor members. So we have enormous amounts to be thankful for them, for that heritage. However, it's 100 years later, and you know, when you get the book, it's the first 2 pages of that chapter, list all the various federal and state laws that already protect workers without unions. Discrimination statute, wage and hour, OSHA, I mean, you can think of all of them, right? So the workplace is so now overly regulated that the idea that somehow we need labor unions on top of that is archaic, okay? And so you'll see that too, when you compare states that protect the workers' right to choose against states like Ohio that are forced unionization, and I don't care, and I do this in the book, you'll see all the numbers, GDP manufacturing, personal income, migration, jobs, the states that protect the workers' right to choose are crushing states like Ohio, even after the massive housing and construction losses in Florida, Nevada, Arizona. Even after that, they're still absolutely crushing us. Let me give you a stat that I think is, to me, one of the most shocking stats you can imagine. Over the